Welcome to the Semi-Retired Podcast, the first episode of 2023. Richard, how you doing?
I'm doing great. And Dave, what's new with you this year?
Thus far, not so much. It's been a quiet couple of days. I've been working on my iTunes library, making sure that my entire musical collection is in tip-top shape. And I understand you, Richard, have something you'd like to say about stop signs.
Dave, you drive a car, right? I mean, you've driven around.
In a manner of speaking, yes.
In a manner of speaking. And you were probably taught by a qualified instructor / belligerent parent.
Both.
Oh, you're in your car, you're driving down the street, you get to what's called an intersection, which is usually where one road intersects another.
I'm familiar with that feature, yes.
And often, if there isn't a series of lights at the top, colored lights, there will be a post with what we call a sign on it.
Like a red metal thing?
Red with usually a word on it that says something like stop, or if wherever you are, it might say arrêt, stop, arrêt.
Yes.
And you'll notice there is no ellipsis after the three dots or a question mark or an italic.
It's quite definitive.
Quite definitive.
It's like, do
It
this
says,
thing, yes.
Stop.
Yes.
So ordinarily, what would you do?
I would stop.
So I'm trying to figure out what the hell's going on with nobody freaking stopping. It's just driving me insane.
It's too early in the year for this kind of anger.
In the last 5 years, it's like it's become freaking optional. People will slow down to the corner and then just go. They don't even stop. Or my favorite, one car goes and the guy behind it goes, I can go too because I'm attached by a magic rope. And they jump the stop sign and you almost crash your car because it's your goddamn turn. This is ridiculous. It's driving me insane.
The modern malaise, everybody's in a rush. Everybody's got to get to the next place as fast as humanly possible and can't take the time to drive in a way such as not to kill other people.
And often I'll see a minivan with a parent in the front, kids in the back, zooming right through stop signs, going right through, slowing down. They'll say they hit the brakes. They slow down. There is no complete, what's that word that's written on there? Stop.
Yeah.
It doesn't say slow. It doesn't say maybe. It says stop. So please, for goddamn sake, could you stop, please?
Yeah, of course, this is the famous American stop that we were counseled against doing in driving class. They said you come to a full stop, you wait for a second, a couple of beats, you look both ways, then you proceed through the intersection, if I'm not mistaken.
If the cops ever want to make their quotas in tickets, stop chasing cars on the highway, stand at an intersection, and just nail every second car that goes by is not making a stop.
I agree. I see the same thing you do. And again, I don't know where the police officers are. They're never there when one of these idiots does what he's doing. I think you could clean up big time.
I think for me, it's a question of reflex and instinct. If you're so used to just slowing down and going, when someone is actually crossing the street, you're not going to react as fast because your reaction is not to stop and go. Your reaction is to slow and keep going. And you're just going to run someone over.
Matter of time. I think that's a completely valid complaint to make. Let's see if in 2023 we can't turn in some of our fellow citizens. Okay? So we sit out there with an iPhone and a six-pack of beer.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? We capture the license plates. And we make a little trip down to the local police station and say, hey, guys.
Yeah, we'll go 1984-ish and we'll turn in our parents.
Yeah, there you go. And bring some donuts with us and some coffee. Hey, boys. Yeah, you look busy. How about this?
So today we're talking about, since, we had a little Philip K. Dick, a little subversive stuff, movies to darken your holidays. We figured we'd pick it up in the new year with
somebody else with an initial. In this case... Just pointing that out. Maybe you think about it.
It's not a K this time.
Not a K, it's an S. It's Hunter S. Thompson. One of my few remaining heroes. I said to Richard a couple of weeks ago, could we do something on Hunter S. Thompson? Richard goes, I'm also a fan to some extent. I think less so than myself, and we'll get into that, but well aware of who the man is. So this episode is called Freak Power in the Rockies, and you'll find out why.
Hunter S. Thompson, and the S stands for?
Stockton.
What an odd middle name, Stockton.
But I love the name Hunter. I think I would have liked to be called Hunter. It's cooler than Dave.
It's not quite as cool to some people in the U.S., right?
Probably not.
I read The Hells Angels sometime in the, I'm guessing, early 80s, because I can still picture myself. I told you the story. I'm standing on a bus and I'm reading about the Hells Angels, and I can still remember the bus. It's the Beaubien bus. I'm standing near the back doors. I'm holding on to a pole and I got the book in my hand and I'm reading that. This
being the book that broke Hunter Thompson when he wrote it in 1960, or he was assigned to write it in 1965. This is called Hells Angels, A Strange and Terrible Saga, or I've seen it in some places, Hells Angels, The Strange and Terrible Saga of the Outlaw Motorcycle Gangs. Yeah. And this made Hunter's reputation as a writer in the around the world, really. I guess mostly in the U.S.
That was my exposure to Hunter early on, although I didn't quite know of the mystique of him back then. I just happened across the book. I'm not sure who gave it to me, who lent it to me, where I picked it up. I don't have it in my collection, so someone must have lent it to me, or it would have been a library book. And so my second exposure to to Thompson would have been, I don't want to say accidental, but maybe incidental, would have been Duke. From Doonesbury.
That's right.
Who was one of my favorite characters on Doonesbury, and only later on did I realize he's modeled after Thompson.
I had the same experience. He was in there, Uncle Duke was, right? Or Raoul Duke, as he called himself. Turns out to be what Hunter Thompson called himself in the writing of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. I didn't know that. Yeah. But this character, because I didn't know what Thompson looked like. I mean, we didn't have the kind of media around us like we do now. So Uncle Duke was just Uncle Duke, this kind of odd cigarette smoking with a what's it called, a cigarette holder, always dropping some kind of psychedelic on himself and just being generally awful to people in the comic. And yes, lo and behold, turns out that Gary Trudeau had patterned Uncle Duke after Hunter S. Thompson in 1974, I think, something like that.
I'm going to ask the question: Is Hunter? His answer is already yes.
Yes.
Is Hunter S. Thompson still relevant today? I did some deep diving on this, did research, watched some documentary, read a bunch of stuff. I came to the conclusion myself that this is a person whose heyday obviously was in the past.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if the influence is still there, or if this is a famous person that is famous for what they did in the past. Has journalism moved in a different direction because of what he did? Because to me, there's a certain point where I feel like a bit like Truman Capote, who wrote some great stuff and then spent the rest of his life on the talk show circuit, bad-mouthing Gore Vidal and fighting, and basically banked on his past fame.
Somewhat like the Rolling Stones still playing Start Me Up 30 years later after they started themselves up, which was 20 years after they couldn't find any satisfaction. So I think we have 50 years of either not finding satisfaction and then starting themselves up. It confuses me. I'm sorry, I got off on a tangent there. So let me try and answer the question. So for people who aren't familiar with Hunter Thompson, he was a writer. He died in 2000. I have to cut to the end to get to the beginning. He died in 2005 by his own hand at 67 years old. He came to public notice, it was mentioned a few minutes ago, via this writing of a book on the Hells Angels. He was assigned to do that as an unknown writer by the editor, I think it was Scanlan's magazine at the time, or The Nation. I'm sorry, maybe it was The Nation. And what had happened was in the fall of 1964, the Hells Angels had gotten themselves into the news because they did their annual run, they called it, a big Labor Day weekend party in California, and got themselves into trouble because the party got out of control. There was allegations of a gang rape that took place. So suddenly the Angels went from being really an unknown quantity anywhere to being talked about in some of the bigger media. Nation magazine says Hunter, and I can't recall how that connection was made. I'd like you to do something on the not the Rolling Stones, on the Hells Angels. The Hells Angels. And Hunter goes off and did what became the thing that made his career, which was he embedded himself with the Hells Angels. And he was a young guy. He's like 35, tall, and he's athletic. So, he's a tough guy to some extent. So he goes and hangs out with the Angels and literally winds up living with them. He liked motorcycles, so he was riding with the Angels. He had something called the Vincent Black Shadow. That was his motorcycle. Okay, so see, Richard knows that. I don't. Hunter had a Vincent Black Shadow, so he gloms on to the Hells Angels, gets to know them by name, hangs out with them all through 1965, invites them. This is in the San Francisco area, so it's the Frisco Angels, not the Purdue Angels or the Berkeley Angels or whatever, Oakland Angels rather. Takes them all down the coast to author Ken Kesey, he of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest fame, he who was written about in Tom Wolfe's The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, he who was the father of the West Coast psychedelic acid scene, takes the Angels down to Kesey's place in La Honda for a big party that's going on. In typical Keseyan fashion, they're like, hey, Angels, like, come on in, have some of whatever we're having. The Angels had never tried acid before or pot. They were beer guys, got totally blissed out, loved it. And suddenly the whole West Coast being, the Angels, they're just like us, except they, have long beards and wear swastikas and drive motorcycles and occasionally beat the shit out of people. They're just like us, but a little bit misunderstood. This whole fusion of Kesey's world, he called his group the Merry Pranksters, the Hells Angels world. Thompson is like this new age journalist, and he comes out with this book that we've talked about already, which I recommend anybody reading. It's a blast. From that, he designates himself, or he describes his style of journalism as Gonzo Journalism, Gonzo, which means becoming part of the story, not just reporting on it from the outside, like a detached observer, like perhaps in fact, I was going to be a journalist at one point early in my life, and we were taught, this whole thing of detachment and objectivity and, just the facts, ma'am. Hunter just got in there and went with it. So he hung out with the Angels for maybe 18 months, reporting in installments in the Nation, I think, that were later collected into the book. In the end, the Angels kind of detected or suspected that he was ripping them off, that he was somehow profiting from their
Well, that's it. They felt he was using their notoriety to make himself famous,
Yes.
and they wanted a share of his profits.
So that became uncomfortable, and Thompson ran afoul of a Hells Angels club rule that angels are obliged to follow, and that rule suggests that if you're with a bunch of angels and an angel attacks you for some reason, or just even like flicks you across the ear for some reason because you've made him upset, all other angels present are obliged to participate. It's in the club charter.
In the flicking of the ear?
In the flicking of the ear. That's right. The tickling of the nose, the razzing of the hair. In this case, typically it was beating someone with a chain or a whip. So Thompson got stomped, got fairly badly beaten. A couple of his buddies in the crowd pulled him out and said, look, just get out of here. Your time's done. That was the end of Thompson's stint with the Angels. Wraps the book up. It's published. The Angels wind up on the cover at this point, but they're on Time Magazine, Newsweek, the whole thing. It's a phenomena. And Hunter becomes the literary equivalent of all the music, the bands, all the art that was happening, all this kind of mid to late 60s cultural explosion. Everything from Andy Warhol to the Beatles to all the San Francisco. It all becomes one thing. And Thompson is their writer. He's the one guy in there who's a journalist. Winds up writing for Rolling Stone magazine next, which was San Francisco's paper that came out of the counterculture. So now the counterculture had its own publication that would talk about John Lennon. I think John was on the front cover of the first issue in September 67. But now they had their cultural political correspondent in Hunter Thompson, Rolling Stone magazine. All this stuff is happening. A couple of years later, the next big piece of work for which he's noted is he gets sent not by Rolling Stone, but by, you told me, Richard, it was Scanlon's to cover the Kentucky Derby. Go to the Kentucky Derby and write 5,000 words about it. They teamed him up with an artist called Ralph Steadman, who became Thompson's partner in the sense that Thompson would write a piece, Steadman would illustrate it, and Richard's going to talk a bit about what made Steadman's illustrations special, because he found this, I had no idea.
So if you look at Steadman's illustrations, they often look like stuff is splattered across. There's drips and stuff. I found out he was doing illustrations with eyeliner to do the black parts, like the inking parts, and lipstick to color in.
Oh,
and
the
that's what gives
flicking.
it. Yeah,
right.
Well, he would open up the thing and just fling it across, and that's how some of that stuff is done. And the text might be done with the eyeliner brush, and so you've got this really very graphic, almost a fuck you to clean design kind of thing, which fit in aesthetically perfectly with Thompson's style of writing.
Steadman, as I found out, had left England a few years before because his work wasn't appreciated. He wanted more freedom of expression. He couldn't have found a better partner in Thompson. So Thompson is sent to cover the Kentucky Derby, which is a big deal. And what he does in his inimitable way is he doesn't so much cover the Derby itself. He never goes anywhere near it, I think, right?
He doesn't even attend the race.
He calls the whole thing a jaded atavistic freakout, a phrase that was just stuck in my mind for 30 years, and just talks about all these crew-cutted Republicans out with their wives and just trashes the whole scene while Steadman is flicking eyeliner and lipstick over his illustrations.
The Kentucky Derby also takes place like in his hometown. And that was one of the reasons he was sent there too. It finishes off with the fact that he comes out the depraved and decadence in the Kentucky Derby, and he comes out and says, well, the depravity and the decadence we saw is basically us. He lived it. He went there, inserted himself into it, and became the main character. And I like this quote here from Harry Kunzru, who's a British author, who wrote, "The true voice of Thompson is revealed to be that of the American moralist, one who often makes himself ugly to expose the ugliness he sees around him."
Oh, that's really good. Yeah.
Right? So you immerse yourself in the ugliness to expose it, but at the same time, you're admitting that you're part of the ugliness.
He was very much like that. At one point, referring to his own countrymen, he said, maybe this is the year that we just lay back and admit it. Just say, fuck it. We're just a nation of 220 million used car salesmen with enough money to buy enough guns to kill anybody that makes us uncomfortable. This is a self-critique.
Wasn't that true today, but maybe the population's a bit higher?
I could probably look that up. Just kind of gross all that up. Yes, he was a moralist. Some people would dislike that, be uncomfortable, think he was a traitor to his country. I don't think so. I don't think so much. I think it's a good idea to turn the spotlight on yourself from time to time and have a good hard look at what goes rushing out from underneath the cupboards. It's a poor analogy I've made there, but
I think it's important to take that into consideration, is that he was not a hypocrite. It's not like he stood back and said, here we are, the depraved of the Kentucky Derby, going on and shitting on someone. He lived it, reported on it, but inserted himself and said, you know what? I know the shit is happening because I participated in it.
Yes.
I'm just as guilty, and therefore I can talk about it because I was there.
That's well said. It's me. That's right. Exactly. It's me, right? I'm part of this whole thing.
Saying it's me, he's also saying it's you.
Yeah. Yeah.
But in a way of disguising it. And I think that's what made the Gonzo journalism, is to be not just reporting on the story, not just inserting yourself in the story as an observer, but also to be an active participant. And I think that part's important.
You're right.
Active
You're right.
participant.
That's right.
And sometimes central participant in the story. And so it's often mentioned that you're not quite sure how much of the story is true, how much is invented, and how much is like a mixing of the two. And sometimes there's no difference between the truth and the invented. There's the quote from McGovern, who had been running for president, who says of one of his articles on the primaries he's reporting, he says, it's the most accurate account of what happened, yet the least factual.
That's fantastic.
It is a fantastic line.
See,
and you could see how, when reading some of his stuff and coming across it, how that's actually, how it makes sense. It doesn't seem to, but it does.
See, just the fact that McGovern could produce that sentence would make me want to vote for him. Because it's a bit late. To loop back to the question, is Thompson still relevant? We're not there yet, but we're getting a sense of why he became a big deal, more so than other journalists of the time. So we have People's Exhibit A with the book The Hells Angels, People's Exhibit B with the article on the Kentucky Derby with Ralph Steadman. And now we start to move toward Hunter's short-lived political ambition, because clearly he's a guy who thinks there's some things wrong with the country. And so we're into 1970 now. I don't think he's written Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas yet, the book for which he is perhaps best known, but it's around the same time. And Hunter, who's living in Aspen, Colorado, decides that he doesn't like the way people are running the place, so he starts his own political campaign that he called Freak Power. You see that on the banner for this episode. And I think that's where his logo appears. That's a double-thumbed fist clutching a peyote button, peyote being a psychedelic. And Hunter sets up shop, decides he's going to clean up Aspen. And I felt that it was a good idea at this point to be able to talk about some of the planks of Hunter's campaign. Oh, and by the way, to show that he continues to be relevant, in 2020, a documentary was released, which I can't find anywhere, called Freak Power, The Ballad of the Bomb, about Hunter's campaign. It was released. I assumed it would be on iTunes or something. It's not. People still thinking about Hunter all these years later. So back to his platform. Here he is, Hunter Thompson, candidate for sheriff. Here's his platform to renew Aspen. Point number 1, rip up all city streets with jackhammers, sod the streets at once. All public movement would be by foot and a fleet of bicycles maintained by the city police force. Point number 2, change the name Aspen by public referendum to Fat City. This would prevent greedheads, land rapers, and other human jackals from capitalizing on the name Aspen. These swine should be fucked, broken, and driven across the land. So, not mincing his words. Point 3, drug sales must be controlled. My first act as sheriff would be to install on the courthouse lawn a bastinado platform and a set of stocks in order to punish dishonest dope dealers in a proper public fashion. Each year, these dealers cheat millions of people out of millions of dollars. It will be the general philosophy of the sheriff's office that no drug worth taking should be sold for money. So, obviously very progressive. A couple more here. Hunting and fishing should be forbidden to all non-residents, with the exception of those who can obtain the signed endorsement of a residence, who will then be legally responsible for any violation or abuse committed by the non-resident he is signed for. By this approach, making hundreds or even thousands of individuals personally responsible for protecting the animals, fish, and birds who live here, we would create a sort of de facto game preserve without the harsh restrictions that will necessarily be forced on us if these bloodthirsty geeks keep swarming in here each autumn to shoot everything they see. I like that. Caring for animals. 2 quick ones to finish up. The Freak Power platform. The sheriff and his deputies should never be armed in public. Every urban riot, shootout, and bloodbath involving guns in recent memory has been set up by some trigger-happy cop in a fear frenzy. And finally, it will be the policy of the sheriff's office savagely to harass all those engaged in any form of land rape. So that was Hunter's platform. And
of course, he won with that.
Came very close. Here's the thing, and I think you know the story. He gathered a very smart, energetic young campaign team around him and did innovative things like shaved his head off so that he could refer to his Republican opponent as
my long-haired opponent.
See, that's judo. I like that. That's judo.
Yeah, that is guerrilla marketing.
That's
right
guerrilla
there.
marketing right there.
Yeah.
So Hunter runs his campaign, and it actually looks like he's doing well. But I think at the end, some sort of skullduggery took place. There was a number of candidates in the race.
3 candidates. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. So the other guy resigned, throwing all the votes to the Republican incumbent, and Hunter lost by literally
not much. Yeah.
Not much, less than 100 votes. Or that platform I've just described would have been in effect in Aspen in 1970. Clearly, it'd be there now. We'd be calling it Fat City, and there'd be no streets.
No streets.
Thought it just trailed off, didn't it?
I was trying to picture it.
Too emotional. That's People's Exhibit 3, is Hunter's campaign for Aspen sheriff. And now at this point, he's transitioning to the time where he's writing the well-known Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas.
Yeah. You can see the transition if we look at Hell's Angels, which is, I don't want to say more factual reporting, but he's not quite as mocking. He's talking about what's going on, what he's doing as a participant in the decadence for the Kentucky Derby. There, he's an active participant and openly mocking what's going on, as opposed to the Hells Angels where he's just reporting what's going on. He's an active participant, but reporting. And here I think he's not just active participant, may have egged some of the stuff on. And then from there, we get into Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, which he's sent to cover. Is it the National Law Enforcement
I think
Convention?
I think so. Yeah, that's what. Yeah.
Which makes it kind of fits in. I mean, he's against hunting here, but he's a huge gun nut.
Yes, he is.
He believes in freedom of expression. He's a member of the NRA. He owns tons of guns, machine guns, all kinds of explosives, famous for blowing things up on his lawn, would fill up cars with dynamite.
Mind you, it should be said that the NRA of 1970 is not the same as the NRA of today. It was far less radical and repulsive.
So are you saying he radicalized it?
I have to think that through.
when there's an avenue.
No.
Yeah.
Definitely not. It seemed worth saying. But yes, he was an NRA member. Loved his guns. Loved to shoot at pheasants on his property in Woody Creek, Colorado, where he was a neighbor with John Denver, by the way. Actually, this could have been a Gary Trudeau thing. Gary Trudeau, writing about Uncle Duke in Doonesbury, like we mentioned, would show Duke on his property and claim that one of his neighbors across the valley was John Denver, who he would hear singing "Country Roads Take Me Home." Uncle Duke would take pot shots at John Denver because he couldn't stand his singing. It would wake him up in the middle of the night, So that was an aside. I'm not going to call that People's Exhibit D, just an aside. So Fear and Loathing, yeah. And I think you read Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas.
I didn't read it. I saw the movie recently. It's an insane depiction. It apparently somewhat accurate to the book from what I've been told.
This is the one with Johnny Depp as Hunter Thompson, right? Who became his great friend.
Johnny Depp lived in the basement for a series of months before filming the movie to really absorb Hunter, his talk, his mannerisms, all of his philosophy so that he could portray that in the movie.
So in a sense, his own kind of gonzoism, getting in there. Actually, no, not so much, because as you said earlier, it's more than embedding yourself in the story. It's about becoming part of the story and actually living it and influencing it, as he did with the election, which Depp, I don't know if he did that or not. He just made himself seem very Hunter Thompson-ish.
You see in some of the documentaries, a lot of actors, Sean Penn is there, John Cusack, Benicio del Toro, of course, played Dr. Gonzo, the lawyer in the movie, are very drawn. Bill Murray, obviously, who played him in Where the Buffalo Roam in 1980, were very drawn to his character. And I think it has to go to, and I wrote something down here, I think actors are drawn to him because he didn't just write the stories. He lived it just as an actor tries to become the character they are portraying. So when you think of method acting and like becoming the character and living that character for a while, I think the fact that Thompson really embodied that in his writing made him an attractive figure to actors, because they say this is not just a guy who writes stories. He is the story. He lives the story. And for them, then they would bring that to their performances.
Yeah, he was enormously respected by a lot of people. You'll find that. I think in a way, I don't want to get to the end, but you'll see what happens at the end of his life. But I'm not sure I can think of any other writers, not that there's anything, about writers that wouldn't attract that kind of devotion, but who attracted that kind of devotion. People who just looked at what he did. McGovern, who you talked about earlier, was his friend for the rest of his life. Even though Hunter's reporting on the primary campaign of 1972, which is going to be the next People's Exhibit, after we wrap up with Fear and Loathing, that really made fun of the whole process and elicited that terrific quote Richard gave you before, which I'm going to have to print out and stick on my wall.
And at the time, he would have been one of the few, if not the only, writer who was a pop icon in a sense, was a popular thing, Think of Warhol, who became an artist who was an iconic person. You don't tend to think of artists as being on talk shows.
So Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, the basic point of it was, and it's embedded in this crazy drug-fueled trip to Las Vegas and the rest of it, but what he's doing is Thompson in 1971, he's looking back and he's reflecting on the failure of the counterculture movement, of which he was so great a part. That which spurred all this great music in the 60s. A lot of people will call it naive, idealistic, doomed from the beginning, whatever. It left behind a tremendous legacy of fantastic music, writing, art, everything from the posters for the San Francisco ballrooms and the psychedelic clubs in the UK, the clothing styles, the whole thing. It was there. It was a big deal. I happen to love the flavor of that era, even though I think I was in Cub Camp when Woodstock happened, so not part of it. But
Were you in Cub Camp at Woodstock?
I haven't actually measured it on the map, but I think I was like closer than I am here. But yeah, like I couldn't hear it or anything.
Yeah.
Even with its excesses and mistakes that were made, I, at the end of the day, look at that period of time and think that must have been fucking special. But don't take my word for it. Let's take Hunter's word for it, because in his book, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, he produced what he considers to be the best writing he ever did. It's something referred to as Hunter Thompson's wave speech, like a wave on the ocean. You can find it on the internet by just Googling Hunter Thompson's wave speech. I will read it here and hope I do it justice, because I'm not the best at reading stuff out loud, as you've discovered from my previous efforts. So in the midst of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, Hunter wrote, "Strange memories on this nervous night in Las Vegas. 5 years later, 6, it seems like a lifetime, or at least a main era, the kind of peak that never comes again. San Francisco in the middle 60s was a very special time and place to be a part of. Maybe it meant something, maybe not in the long run, but no explanation. No mix of words or music or memories can touch that sense of knowing that you were there and alive in that corner of time and the world, whatever it meant. History is hard to know because of all the hired bullshit. But even without being sure of history, in quotes, it seems entirely reasonable to me to think that every now and then the energy of a whole generation comes to a head in a long, fine flash, for reasons that nobody really understands at the time and which never explain, in retrospect, what really happened. My central memory of that time seems to hang on 1 or 5 or maybe 40 nights or very early mornings when I left the Fillmore, which was a rock club, half crazy, and instead of going home, aimed the big 650 Lightning across the Bay Bridge at 100 miles an hour, wearing LL Bean shorts and a Butte sheepherder's jacket, booming through the Treasure Island Tunnel at the lights of Oakland and Berkeley and Richmond, not quite sure which turnoff to take when I got to the other end, always stalling at the toll gate, too twisted to find neutral while I fumbled for change, but being absolutely certain that no matter which way I went, I would come to a place where people were just as high and wild as I was. No doubt about that at all. There was madness in any direction, at any hour, if not across the bay, then up the Golden Gate, or down 101 to Los Altos or La Honda. That was Kesey's place I mentioned. You could strike sparks anywhere. There was a fantastic universal sense that whatever we were doing was right, that we were winning. And that, I think, was the handle. That sense of inevitable victory over the forces of old and evil. Not in any mean or military sense. We didn't need that. Our energy would simply prevail. There was no point in fighting. We had all the momentum. We were riding the crest of a high and beautiful wave. So now, less than 5 years later, you can go up on a steep hill in Las Vegas and look west. And with the right kind of eyes, you can almost see the high water mark, that place where the wave finally broke and rolled back. That's Hunter's wave speech. Mm-hmm. I've had this printed out on a piece of paper. I would stick it on the wall in my office and my various jobs because I think it's just beautiful.
Beautiful, and to talk about the end of hope almost.
You're right. I mean, I call it beautiful writing, but yes, it describes the end of that kind of hope. That then was reflected in the Who song, Won't Get Fooled Again, Meet the New Boss, same as the old boss. Everything had gotten fucked up when there was the murder at Altamont, the Rolling Stones free concert in 1969. But the Hells Angels were hired to do security. And you can only imagine that happened because of the notoriety they got from being connected with Kesey and the gang through Hunter 4 years earlier at La Honda. By 1971, Hunter releases Fear and Loathing, People's Exhibit D, I've lost track now, but the next People's Exhibit that's really built his reputation to quite a head, has really made a name for himself in the most unusual of fashions. As Richard pointed out earlier, as a cultural icon, more so than just the guy who's writing about whatever they've sent him to write about.
Yeah, and he's come to the point where now he participated in a kind of counterculture and has come to realize that it's all come to naught, is kind of pissed off in the fact that the hippies, although talking about war and peace, and in the end just wanted to get high. He saw it as that. They just wanted to get high because nothing super positive came out of that. What happened to all those guys? Well, they all became businessmen later on.
Absolutely. They came roaring back 10 or 12 years later as entrepreneurs. And that movement was not a monolith. There was the actual hippies who lived in San Francisco and Haight-Ashbury. That was a very specific place. They were very much about free love and free drugs and all that. There was the anti-war movement. There was the more intellectual movements of the 1960s, whether it was through art or whether it was through music. But yeah, he looked at the actual hippies themselves, as did people like Jimi Hendrix. You hear Hendrix singing, if the hippies cut off all their hair, I don't care. A lot of people thought the hippies were sort of losers. The pure hippies. That's not just a blanket term to apply to anybody with long hair. It was that group. It's 1971. Hunter's writing for Rolling Stone magazine. And lo and behold, he gets asked to cover we've talked about this a bit, the Democratic primary in 1972, which is pitting George McGovern, who is the choice of all the young people in the country and the progressive left. He's the darling. And he's pitted against, amongst other candidates, Edmund Muskie, the man from Maine. That was his tagline.
The other thing is Muskie, not the fish.
Not the fish. I like that. Not the fish. Yeah. I mean, you can imagine in today's parlance that Muskie would be like a corporate Democrat and McGovern would have been like Bernie. McGovern's got all the energy and the kids love him and there's a big youth vote coming out and the people who, watch the purse strings are getting really nervous that this crazy guy McGovern might win. So Hunter's on the campaign trail.
And who's the Republican?
The Republican, what's Nixon? A man
who Hunter really looked up to, right?
Yeah, I think he said that Nixon was so crooked, he needed to have his servants screw him into his pants each morning. Which is one of my favorite quotes. That's one of the
nicer quotes I've read, because some of them are like pretty nasty.
Yeah, some are quite nasty. In fact, I will actually, if I don't have it here, I will pause the recording and get it afterwards. So Hunter sent out on the campaign trail to cover the primary. And lo and behold, does his Gonzo thing. And before long, his reports are coming back and he's like dropping acid with the Secret Service. There's all this stuff going on. And he winds up talking to Nixon in a urinal somewhere. Turns out they both like football. So actually him and Nixon bond over football. Who would report that? And yet there it is. People are loving it. One of my favorite stories from that campaign, the one I was talking about just before we started taping, is that Muskie became known for doing really boring campaign speeches. So Hunter wrote that he had discovered Muskie was eating ibogaine, which is a psychedelic that's extracted from the tree bark of a certain Central African tree. And it's used by the indigenous blow dart hunters so that they can remain motionless in the forest for days at a time. So he claims that Muskie is eating this, and that's why his campaign stops are so boring. And it became a big deal because Rolling Stone's a big paper at this point. And there's a clip of Thompson being interviewed by Peter Zosky, our Canadian journalist. He goes, I'd like to talk about this business about Ed Muskie and ibogaine and all the rest of it. And Thompson's just nodding. And he goes, you claim that this information was leaked via a rumor. Can you tell us who actually started the rumor? And Thompson says, yeah, it was me. Which, yeah,
again,
perfect
Gonzo, right?
Perfect Gonzo.
Put yourself in the story and then be in the story.
Yeah, leak the story, report on it, wind up upsetting the entire nation and being talked about it on Canadian TV of all places. When I read that at the time, or saw that tape rather, I couldn't stop laughing. It was just perfect. Yeah, I did it. I would recommend to anybody, buy Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail. It's a riot. It doesn't matter that you don't know the politicians. It doesn't matter. It's just so funny. And he also writes about himself, how things aren't working. Like he's trying to shove pages into the fax machine because he keeps saying that the Rolling Stone office is screaming for pages. He's in a hotel room that's like stocked with every known drug, alcohol, whatever. It's fantastic.
Yeah, and he's famously one of the early adopters of the fax machine and would travel with a fax machine so that he could send stuff in quickly to Rolling Stone. But he'd just bash out something and here, shut up, here's a page, go with this. There's a quote here from Robert Love, who was Thompson's editor for 23 years at Rolling Stone.
I never heard of the man, really.
So he's talking about fact-checking. And he says, discerning the line between fact and the fiction of Thompson's work presented a practical problem for editors and fact-checkers of his work. Love called fact-checking Thompson's work one of the sketchiest occupations ever created in the publishing world. And for a first-timer, a trip through a journalistic funhouse where you didn't know what was real and what wasn't. You knew you had better learn enough about the subject at hand to know when the rift began and when reality ended. And he says, Hunter was a stickler for numbers. For details like gross weight, model numbers, lyrics, and caliber, there was no faking it. So that stuff was true. If he said, I brought in 20 pounds of acid, if you could actually hear him, because he was a notorious mumbler.
Yeah, he's a mumbler. Yeah.
That stuff he would get real. But the rest of the stuff, you weren't sure. And they also goes on to say, like, sometimes they had to do massaging of the text because he knew a lot of very prominent Democrats and a lot of people in politics. And so some of the stuff he would say, they would kind of had to mask not to reveal identities so that they wouldn't get too many people in trouble.
Not politically correct, as we came to call it years later.
Well, they weren't protecting Thompson. I think they were protecting the politicians or whoever he was speaking to.
Can you please read the George McGovern description again? Because I just need to refresh myself. He called him what? The least or the most?
I'm pretty sure it's McGovern. He said his accounting of the events was the most accurate depiction of the event, but the least factual.
Again, see, that was worth saying again because in that is everything. We arrive with Hunter in 1972. He's a cultural icon, as Richard pointed out. It's around this time or a year or two later that Doonesbury latches onto him and makes him Uncle Duke. So we're getting into the mid-70s now. He's picking up assignments. Like I think he went to write about the Ali Fraser fight in Africa. And a number of others. Some of his work from this period has been gathered into a rather thick volume called The Great Shark Hunt, writing about all kinds of stuff. Yes, politics. Yes, commenting on American society. Kind of doing his thing. With the benefit of hindsight, we can see that the wheels are starting to spin a little bit. Kind of like when the Rolling Stones started doing Goat's Head Soup. I know that Hunter at that point, he had become concerned that he had become a character. The way he had presented himself had become a separate entity. He became something else, and that bothered him.
And I think also if he showed up somewhere, sometimes people wanted the character and not Hunter. They wanted Gonzo.
It's one of these things I've read about, like how much of that was real and how much of it was fake, or how much it was just exaggerated. How out of control was his writing? I've heard his writing described as like surgically precise. In fact, I think when he was in school or later in his early 20s as an aspiring writer, he would literally type out novels by Hemingway and whatever just to feel what the key sequence would feel like.
There's a scene of him talking about it, and he says, I wanted to see what it would be like to write those words. And so he would type out all the famous novels of that time, and he would just type them out to get the feeling of having written them, what it would have felt like to have those words flow from your fingers.
That's a very different man to what we've described. Yeah. And you begin to wonder how much of it is smoke and mirrors and how much is really utter command of language, but written in such a way to sound like it's out of control.
It goes back a little bit to what I was saying about method acting, right?
Yes.
He kind of did that with those writers, Steinbeck and Hemingway and whatever. He kind of channeled them a little bit. And from there, I think he got a feel for what the narrative that flowed and took that and made it his own.
And another thing to note is that you look at Hunter's writing and he doesn't punctuate like anybody else. It's not like sentence period, the occasional semicolon thrown in for a little je ne sais quoi. Yeah. It's very different. It's a bit like Tom Wolfe's electric Kool-Aid acid test. There's all kinds of ellipses or ellipsi or M dashes, all kinds of stuff going on. I was struggling with it, frankly, reading that passage before because, again, I'm used to going sentence period, and you keep getting tripped up to some extent. But that was his craft, and he was really good at it. At least I think we both think he was really good at it. One of the reasons we're talking about him is because of that. Moving through the 1970s now, Hunter's writing about a bunch of different topics, but he's still got his laser focus on politics, especially in the person of Richard Nixon, who winds up resigning in August of 1974, Watergate scandal. If I'm not mistaken, Thompson at this point had some choice words for Mr. Nixon that Richard has at his fingertips.
Following Nixon's pardon by Gerald Ford in 1974, Hunter ruminated on the roughly $400,000 pension Nixon maneuvered his way into by resigning before being formally indicted. It's a beautiful move.
Almost like ballet.
The Washington Post was lamenting Nixon's lonely and depressed state after being forced from the White House. Hunter wrote that if there's such thing as justice in the world, Nixon's rancid carcass would be somewhere down around Easter Island right now in the belly of a hammerhead shark. And that's one of the nicer quotes. Once again, really did not like the man.
Oh, that's funny. I think he continued to say horrible things about Nixon over the years, but his next target was when the Reagan administration came into power in 1980.
Because his peak would have been 65 to 75.
I think that's fair. I think if you put brackets over those years, you don't need anything else. A bit like the Stones, you could go 65 to 75. Some girls burped out 3 years later, but really that's all you need. You don't need 40 years of whatever they've got. So by 1980, we have the election of Ronald Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in the UK. And we begin the great rightward shift of politics that has led us down the road to where we are today. Hunter was saying things like, I miss Nixon compared to these Nazis, the Reagan administration, that we have in the White House now. Richard Nixon was a flaming liberal. I have to repeat this because it's so funny. He said that Nixon was so crooked that he needed servants to help him screw his pants on every morning. Just, it went on and on.
Visual. I wonder if there's a Stedman illustration of that.
That would be really good, eh? Because you start to think, well, how would that look? So he carried on, but he lost his teeth and his sense of purpose. Now you're 10 years past the point in time when literally he came out and acknowledged that the countercultural movement that everybody had been so much a part of and so excited about and so motivated by had failed and had been replaced by Alex Keaton on Family Ties.
And would have maybe been seen at the time as your dad's hero and not relevant anymore because yes, you had a point of view, but you're so stuck back there. Is your point of view relevant today? We've moved on.
He also said at that point, he said, I feel the same way about disco as I do about herpes. We both like music, so I kind of my
Okay, I was going to say you and I both like herpes.
No, disco. That was a band, the band Herpes. They were a punk band, I think. Yeah, not sure. Yeah,
It would have been. It has
Herpes
to be.
Live. Yeah. As an aside, I kind of made peace with disco 40 years later.
Yeah.
I have maybe 25 songs that were the best of the bunch, and I can understand. But at the time, I don't know about you, but I thought the end of the world had come. Along the way, Rick Hunter managed to criticize just about everything you can imagine, including his own profession. Journalism is not a profession or a trade. It's a cheap catch-all for fuck-offs and misfits. A false doorway to the backside of life, a filthy, piss-ridden little hole, nailed off by the building inspector, but just deep enough for a wino from the sidewalk to curl up in and masturbate like a chimp in a zoo cage, said he about his own profession.
Now, is there a Stedman illustration of that?
Might be. Also of writing, he said, I've always considered writing the most hateful kind of work. I suspect it's a bit like fucking, which is only fun for amateurs. Old whores don't do much giggling. Yes, Hunter. This is one of my favorites. He said of the television business is a cruel and shallow money trench, a long plastic hallway where thieves and pimps run free and good men die like dogs. I also had that on my wall. On my wall, because I just find it so refreshingly funny that he can say, because he did say of himself, life has become immeasurably better since I have been forced to stop taking it seriously. By what? I don't know. But you have to admit, there's something about that kind of writing. I just find that so attractive. And he was a music lover too, since we were talking about music.
Yet, never wrote a piece about music for Rolling Stone. He's the only contributor to Rolling Stone magazine that never contributed a music piece.
I can't imagine him writing a music piece. I'm trying now. I mean, a few seconds in, right? I have to ruminate on this. But
Could you imagine him doing a music piece on your favorite Bieber?
Oh, if only the years were slightly different. If only there was overlap.
Yeah.
I'll take that with me for a while.
There you go.
Said Hunter of music, music has always been a matter of energy to me, a question of fuel with a capital F. Sentimental people call it inspiration, but what they really mean is fuel. I have always needed fuel. I am a serious consumer. On some nights, I still believe that with the gas needle on empty, I can run about 54 miles if I have on the right music very loud on the radio.
100% agree.
You just think, what the hell? A little AC/DC rolling, everything's going to be just fine. That's another side of Hunter's character. Here's another quote from later in Hunter's career. In these long, somewhat empty times in terms of content, he still managed to, come up with a turn of phrase. Here I think he's talking about the AIDS epidemic in the mid-'80s. He says, there are times, however, and this is one of them, when even being right feels wrong. What do you say, for instance, about a generation that has been taught that rain is poison and sex is death? If making love can be fatal and if a cool spring breeze on any summer afternoon can turn a crystal blue lake into a puddle of black poison right in front of your eyes, there's not much left except TV and relentless masturbation. Sorry, I couldn't finish that. Okay, I'm not going to keep reading Thompson quotes, but you get a sense, a bit like George Carlin. George Carlin is one of my favorite comics, and I can listen to him anytime. But it has to be said that at the end, in the last few years, his humor took on an edge that was so dark that there was bitterness to it. That's the exactly perfect word. I think some of that crept into Hunter's writing. It wasn't so much fun anymore. It was bitter. So by the mid-'80s, he was he was still talking about the Reagans and all that. He released a collection of his writings, I think in 1987, called The Generation of Swine. I remember not being able to go through it. It should have meant more to me because it was more contemporary to my time, and yet I found it less engaging to read. And maybe that's a reflection of the fact that he'd run out of steam or his, his mojo, whatever you call it, had collapsed.
Could it be, Dave, that although it was contemporary to your times, he was no longer a contemporary participant in it, where he was really involved and embedded, to use that term, in his other stories?
I think that's very perceptive. I think that's true. He wasn't that guy anymore. He was 10, 15 years older. He couldn't do things the way he used to. It was showing. He came to Montreal during that period. I went to see this particular appearance of his. It was at Concordia University downtown, the Hall building. It's called Fear and Loathing at Concordia, cleverly enough. And I have the poster somewhere. It was all paint flecked like Stedman.
That's where we had Freeman.
Lettering. Exactly. It was in there. So I go down. It was afternoon. My boss let me take some time off work. And I went down with my buddy Mike. Got in there and I was like, oh, it's Hunter. And I think I brought Hell's Angels to ask him to autograph it. I remember thinking, oh, what a tacky thing to do. But I'm going to do it. Like, I have to do it, even though I hated myself. And then I became violently ill. I became nauseous. I'm not making this up. This never happens. So I'm sitting there. I remember Hunter sitting on stage and he's tossing grapefruits back and forth to the audience. And I'm feeling more and more sick. I had to leave to the men's room, threw up violently, and then came in my friend Mike and said, like, you got to drive me home. And I missed the whole show.
What I'm guessing happened is Thompson hired blow dart people to shoot anybody who showed up with a book.
Not impossible.
To be signed.
Not impossible, Richard.
I poisoned you to avoid the indignity of having to sign old work.
I've always been suspicious about what happened there.
The
Because
magic loogie.
honestly, I think it's the only time in my life I had to leave somewhere. It wasn't like I puked and felt better. I had to go. And I fell asleep in the car on the way home, and it was a whole mess. So that was my Hunter Thompson near close encounter.
Yeah, but that must be like so disappointing to have been close to someone who's one of your heroes and to not be able to attend.
Just talking about it now is making me angry, emotional. There's a whole cocktail of things going on here.
But now you got a great story out of it.
I do,
Had
yeah.
you gone and it turned out to be like a super depressing thing about an old guy just reminiscing and mumbling, it might have killed the mystique of Hunter for you. So in a way, it's perfect. You embedded yourself in the story, threw up, had to leave. Look like he did at some of it. He didn't attend the race.
You could charge money for stuff like that, you know? I'm actually beginning to feel better about it for the first time in 30 years.
Hey, my job is done.
Thank you very much, Richard. Now we've arrived at the new century. So as the new century began, Hunter had only tragically a handful of years to live. He was writing for ESPN at that point.
And also, till his death, they kept the position of editor World Affairs over at Rolling Stone.
Right.
And they left it there, even though he never really hadn't contributed anything to it in 10 or 15 years.
Yeah.
They left it there as an honorary until the day he died.
Yeah, the National Affairs Desk. That was what they
that's
called
it,
it, right? Yeah. Because I think him and Wenner, their relationship was a bit fraught sometimes. Again, I'm never sure if that's real or not. Is that part of the mystique that him and Wenner would fight a lot, or they just like it to be that way? I don't know. Hunter, I'm sure, would have been not an easy employee in that sense. Wouldn't have made it easy for Wenner to do his job. And, you know, I think in general, I saw a clip somewhere where Hunter shows up at the San Francisco offices at one point with a fire extinguisher and goes in and just lets it off at
At his desk while he's sitting there. He just hoses him with it.
Because he hosed Wenner? Yeah, that's right. He hosed Wenner.
Yeah.
So you're like, okay, is that a stunt or is that, I don't know. And as Richard mentioned earlier, he's always on his porch raising and shooting peacocks, all this weird stuff. He'd gotten weird. Yeah. And if you see him in the last few years of his life, he looks like, you know, he's had a tough time with things. Yeah. For a relatively young man.
I think he had a hip replacement. He's got a few things. A whole bunch of health issues are coming on. And for a guy who's used to living very hard and very fast, whether it was drinking, drugs, driving, exploding things on his ranch, I think that took a toll on him, the fact that he could not do those things anymore.
Mind you, my barber has had both hips replaced. I just feel I should work that in there.
Hats off to Armando.
Rides his bike to work every morning.
Yes, but he also probably didn't live the hard life that Hunter did. And I don't mean hard as in hardship. I meant...
Probably not.
He wrote it hard. He
Probably
drank.
not.
He did every hallucinogenic. He did every drug he could.
Well, he's never stabbed me in the ear while he's cutting my hair or anything, and I've never come out of there bald or something. We're now coasting down to Hunter's last few years, and I don't mean to be laughing here because I love this guy's work. You know, I wish I hadn't thrown up and I'd been able to at least shake his hand or have him autograph my book. But definitely in those last few years, he's seemed to be a man who'd lost his sense of purpose.
And tired also of having to live the persona, right, all the time.
Yeah.
To be bigger than life. And you couldn't just be himself. People would expect him to be on. They're like, oh, we're going to see Hunter. What craziness is he going to do today?
Yeah.
And if you don't do that, people are disappointed.
You know who suffered that was Keith Moon. Keith Moon said everybody expected him to throw television sets out of hotel windows or to be like just drinking all the time. And he said it was exhausting.
Can you imagine someone visited him at his house? He's like, Christ, I got to throw a TV out the window of my own house.
Exactly. I know.
It's getting expensive.
Yeah. Hunter took his own life in the spring of 2005. I can recall hearing about it, and I say what I'm about to say. I don't mean to be this at all flippant. I kind of wasn't surprised. I wasn't shocked that he had done that. Obviously, the health issues were there, as he talked about. But I thought if anybody was not going to want to become 80 years old under any circumstances, having been what he once was and having attached himself so indelibly to this philosophy, and again, you just alluded to it, to the speed and the action and the inside game, it would be Hunter. Mm-hmm. And so sadly, he took his life with one of his revolvers at his home in Woody Creek, Colorado. There were some peculiar circumstances that you were talking about earlier in terms of his family, how they reacted.
He was on the phone with his wife at the time, and she heard the gun cock, but thought it was him hitting a key on his typewriter. And as she hung up, he fired the gun. That's the story that goes on, allegedly, like she would have maybe been hanging up while he shot
He
himself.
never used a computer, right? I think he wrote with the IBM Selectric to the end, I think.
As far as I know, yeah.
Good, bad, or indifferent, just saying.
His son, like from police records, they realized that they only called the police like a half hour later after the incident. And his son apparently came out half hour later. They thought it was some sort of just some noise. They thought a book had fallen off the shelf. Okay. That's right. And so they got up a half hour later, found his father dead, went out, took a shotgun and fired 3 blasts into the air to announce the end of Hunter S. Thompson, and then called the police. And allegedly, there's a sheet of paper in the typewriter with the date February 22nd, 05, and one single word that says counselor. Now, whether this is true or not, I don't know. Counselor, yeah.
Like a lawyer or like a...
Dr. Gonzo would have been his counselor, right? As he often called his lawyer, counselor.
Right, that's right, yeah.
And so later on, Rolling Stone published what Douglas Brinkley described as a suicide note written by Thompson to his wife, titled "Football Season is Over." And Dave, you're going to read that?
Football season is over. Below that, 5 very brief sentences. No more games, period. No more bombs, period. No more walking, period. No more fun, period. No more swimming, period. All with all words capitalized. And he was always very careful about how he presented his words, so that meant something. Down below that, 67, the number, his age, period. That is 17 years past 50. 17 more than I needed or wanted. Boring. I am always bitchy, period. No fun for anybody, period. 67 again, period. You are getting greedy, period. Act your old age, period. Relax, this won't hurt. Barry Hunter.
Decided to end it in a way of his own choosing instead of having his body slowly decay. And he may have been feeling it mentally also. Years of hard drugs and drinking might do that to you also. He's not as sharp. He's not as fast. His writing is not as appreciated anymore. And his time is gone, his essence. We go back to Roy Batty, the candle that burns twice as bright burns half as long. We go back to Blade Hunter, and he did burn ever so bright during his time, that 10 years. He was prolific. He lived life hard and fast.
So, yeah, I remember distinctly hearing that had happened and thinking, okay, not surprised. Yeah. And actually feeling that for him, that was probably a good thing. Did it his own way. Don't mean that to sound macabre, but yes.
If we go back to my question, Is Thompson relevant today, and what can you take from that? I have a takeaway. What would you say?
I think he's still relevant today in the sense that I think that the way he changed journalism, I think it still echoes and ripples through today's journalistic market. He broke ground in a lot of ways. I think he showed that journalism could be more than just Walter Cronkite, I'll pick that, or Johnny Apple or whatever it was at the New York Times, just a very dry, just the facts, ma'am, and like the 5 W's. And you could bring more value to the proposition. I think that his relevance is clearly, he's still on somebody's radar because of the movie that was just made about the freak power election or the attempt in 1970. I mean, why would somebody a full 50 years later decide to put money into a documentary about this long forgotten event that really was just a weird blip? So clearly he still means something to somebody, not just myself. Johnny Depp is still interested in making more movies about his life. So he's relevant to Johnny Depp. Should be pointed out that at Hunter's funeral, an enormous number of guests showed up. 250 guests. Yeah. George McGovern was there. And this is a national politician who went to see this freak power guy to pay respects at his funeral. John Kerry was there of the Democratic Party. Yes, Johnny Depp, Sean Penn was there. You said John Cusack was there.
And the thing about his funeral was they erected this tower where they then proceeded to, with a cannon on top, and they proceeded to fire his ashes out the cannon out onto his lawn.
And I think the cannon looks like the fist logo that you see on the banner for this episode.
There's something to that. There's a statue there. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like Johnny Depp bankrolled it, right?
Yeah. So according to his widow, the funeral cost $3 million, and Johnny Depp picked up the tab.
See, that would have been a lot of money to Hunter. I don't think he's a guy who accumulated a lot of money in his life, did well for himself, but wasn't a multimillionaire. Back to that, is he still relevant? I'm biased toward thinking yes. I'm biased towards thinking that he cast a long shadow, and that these, actors, if you will, at least in this case, who are of a much younger generation, born in the 60s like we were, not in the 30s like Hunter was, still think a lot of this guy and want to pay homage to what he produced in his life. So I say yes, but I'm biased.
If there was 2 people who were still around today at the peak of their powers, let's say, to comment on the political situation we're seeing today, whether it's, the right, the movements on the right, the whole Supreme Court madness that's going on. To me, it would have been George Carlin and I think Hunter. I would have loved to have their take. Could you imagine Hunter covering the elections going on today in the U.S.? It would have been amazing. I think at some point he would have lost his mind with the madness of what's going on.
It's so detached from anything, the Trump phenomenon. He's selling NFTs now, where he looks like a Superman. I don't know what's going on. I don't even know how to connect that to any kind of reality, but it was fine. But to your point, yes, I'll throw in a third. I would love it if Christopher Hitchens was still alive. He who passed away from cancer in, I think, 2010. One of my favorite writers of all time. Not a Thompson-y kind of writer, but a harsh critique of things he disagreed with. English, located to the U.S. in, I think, 1990, because that's where he always wanted to live. Didn't like conservative Britain. Was a left-winger his whole life, except controversially came out in favor of the Iraq War and took a lot of heat for it. Okay. And then wound up, sadly, passing away of cancer, as I mentioned, at maybe he was 60. I'd like to hear what Christopher Hitchens has to say.
I don't think we have that level of political commentary today.
I can't find it.
What you have is extremes on both sides. I think you have a lot of talking heads right now who are just mouthing off, quoting each other kind of thing. But we don't have someone who can kind of sit there and say, hey, both of you are idiots. This is what's really going on. And let's pull our heads up out of our asses and look at the world for what it really is.
Yeah, there's no one to command attention on that level. Like, I can't think of one. I mean, I don't know about you in terms of news. I don't watch the broadcast news.
Big box news
at all. In fact, I had the unfortunate experience. It was the day of the U.S. midterms, and I decided that I would like to see how that was going to go, but I didn't want to watch it. So I put on MSNBC on TV here, which is the only big box channel. In fact, I should get rid of cable. I don't watch cable anymore. I just haven't done it. And I put it on loud enough that he went into my office to do some work. Number one, I couldn't believe how much advertising there was, because I don't encounter advertising. I think like you, I've turned it off everywhere. I pay for YouTube to be ad-free. The streaming services don't have it. It was just pharma ad after pharma ad after pharma ad after retirement ad after pharma ad. Over and over and over again, while they're literally giggling their way through the whole midterms. I found it incredibly offensive. So I don't watch that stuff. I have my sources. I'm a progressive politically. Cards on the table. That's where my anchor is. But I try to find people to talk from that perspective who aren't just flippant mouth-offs. And I can find them. I know where they are. Why did I go off on that tangent, Richard? Because it's our show.
We do what the hell
we do what the hell we want. That's right.
My takeaway from this after doing the search takes me back to something my younger brother said to me one time. There's a difference between living and existing. If you just walk through life doing your chores, doing your things, going to work, coming back, that's existing. And you're no different than a houseplant. Living is participating in everything going on around you, to be an active participant. And I think you can say Hunter was a liver. That didn't sound...
Hold on a second. Hunter was a liver. I think we should keep that in.
I don't know. That's not what I
know you think we should go.
Hunter lived rather than existed. And I think when he got to the point where he was just existing, he didn't like that anymore.
No, I agree with you. Yeah.
Be an active participant. Don't just sit there and watch TV.
Don't be a chicken. Be a liver. See, I've done it. That justifies keeping that in.
Don't be a chicken, be an egg. Hold on,
wait a second. That's too much.
Yeah.
Okay. Still got too much eggnog.
Yeah, too much. It's the holidays.
It's the holidays. That's right. Here in Canada, in Montreal.
I'm not editing this.
That'll be fun. Yeah. Richard, that was a terrific discussion. We found something else, Hunter Thompson, we both have an interest in, which is great.
And we'll see you next week.
See you next week. Have a good one. Bye.